It's easy to believe that fame breaks people. That the lights are too bright, the applause too loud, the expectations too heavy. That success itself is the poison. For years that's what people said about me. That the stages, the tours, the pressure of being Whitney Houston, were what finally cracked something inside. But that was never the full truth. Fame didn't break me. It exposed what was already hurting, and magnified it until there was nowhere left to hide. This story isn't about the height of success you saw on television or the records that played on repeat around the world. It's about the quiet spaces between those moments. The hotel rooms after the crowds disappeared. The phone calls that ended in silence. The promises made to me, and the ones I made to myself that slowly unraveled. I'm telling this story from inside my own mind, where applause fades fast and doubt lingers longer. Where love and control sometimes wear the same face. Where strength isn't about hitting the high notes, but about surviving the weight of expectations no one ever teaches you how to carry. What really broke me wasn't fame. It was what I gave away trying to survive it. And once you hear the truth, you may never look at success the same way again. People think the breaking point arrives loudly. They imagine a headline, a scandal, a public fall so obvious no one can miss it. They think there's a single moment where everything shatters and the world watches in real time. But that's not how it happened for me. For me, it started quietly. It started with exhaustion that sleep didn't fix. I remember standing backstage one night, the roar of the crowd bleeding through the curtains like a living thing, vibrating in my chest. My name was being chanted, not sung, not whispered, shouted. Thousands of voices calling for me as if I belonged to them. I should have felt powerful. Instead, I felt hollow. A stylist adjusted my dress, tugging too tight at the waist. "You're going to be incredible tonight," she said automatically. Everyone always said that. No one ever asked how I felt. "How much time?" I asked. 2 minutes. 2 minutes to become what they needed. I stared at my reflection. The woman looking back at me was flawless on the surface. Hair perfect, makeup glowing, posture trained into elegance. But behind my eyes was someone I barely recognized. Someone who had learned how to disappear while standing in the brightest light imaginable. That was the first crack. Not the pressure to perform. I loved singing. I loved the way music could lift me out of myself. What weighed on me was everything that came after. The expectations that followed me off stage. The version of Whitney people believed they owned. Strong, grateful, smiling, always available. I stepped onto the stage and did what I had always done. Sing. I gave them everything. I felt the music rise through me. Felt the power in my voice remind me that I was still real, still capable of beauty. But when the last note faded and the applause thundered, something inside me shrank instead of expanding. Back in the dressing room, the noise disappeared all at once. Silence rushed in, thick and heavy. Someone handed me a towel. Someone else praised a high note. Someone mentioned numbers, sales, ratings, expectations. No one mentioned me. That night, alone in the hotel room, I sat on the edge of the bed fully dressed, staring at the wall. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I just felt tired in a way that scared me. Because it wasn't physical. It was emotional erosion. I thought about how young I'd been when people started telling me who I was. Not asking, telling. How quickly love turned into demand. How approval became conditional. How saying no started to feel dangerous. I had learned early that being easy made life smoother. That compliance was rewarded. That boundaries were interpreted as attitude. So I softened myself, again and again, until I couldn't feel where I ended and everyone else began. The next morning my schedule started before I did. Calls, meetings, interviews. Smiles put on like armor. I answered questions about success while quietly wondering why it felt like I was losing something every day. During one interview, the host laughed and said, "You make it all look so effortless." I laughed too. That word, effortless, stuck with me. People don't see the effort it takes to carry other people's expectations. The effort it takes to stay agreeable when you're exhausted. To remain grateful when you're overwhelmed. To keep giving when you're running on empty. Effortless is what they call it when they don't want to acknowledge the cost. Later that day, I cancelled plans and stayed alone. Rare, precious solitude. I lay on the floor, staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the air conditioner. No applause. No demands. Just quiet. And in that quiet, a realization crept in. Soft but terrifying. I wasn't afraid of failing. I was afraid of disappearing. Of losing myself completely to a role I never auditioned for. Fame hadn't hurt me yet. Not directly. What hurt was the slow surrender. The way I had learned to trade pieces of myself for approval. The way I had convinced myself that being needed was the same as being loved. That was the moment I understood something fundamental. Whatever was breaking inside me didn't start on stage. It started the first time I believed my worth depended on how well I performed. Not just as a singer but as a person. And as I lay there, alone with that truth, a question surfaced that refused to leave me. If fame wasn't the thing breaking me, then what or who had been quietly shaping the cracks all along? I didn't wake up broken. That's another myth people like to believe. That pain announces itself, that damage is obvious. Most days I woke up functional. Smiling. Time. Prepared. If brokenness had a uniform, I wore it well. The real damage lived in the choices I kept making without realizing they were choices at all. I noticed it first in relationships. Not the public ones, those were easy. Fans adored me from a distance. Industry people respected what I could deliver. It was the private connections that confused me. The ones where love blurred into obligation, where loyalty came with conditions, where control wore the costume of care. I had been taught, subtly and repeatedly, that my value increased when I was agreeable. So I became very good at agreeing. Agreeing to schedules that left no room to breathe. Agreeing to opinions about my image, my sound, my life. Agreeing to people who told me they knew what was best for me, even when something inside whispered otherwise. That whisper was soft. I ignored it often. One night, after a long day of rehearsals, I sat in a car outside a house I wasn't sure I wanted to enter. The engine was off. The street was quiet. My reflection stared back at me from the windshield, tired and uncertain. I realized I was bracing myself. Not for conflict. For disappearance. I walked inside anyway. That's how it always went. I told myself it was easier not to rock the boat. Easier to adjust than to explain. Easier to give than to demand. But ease comes at a price. The price is self-trust. I started questioning my instincts. If something felt wrong, I assumed I was overreacting. If I felt unheard, I told myself I hadn't spoken clearly enough. If I felt controlled, I reframed it as protection. Because admitting otherwise meant facing something frightening. That I had allowed people too much access to my inner world simply because I didn't want to be alone. The irony was cruel. The more I gave, the lonelier I felt. I remember standing in a kitchen late one night, lights dimmed, listening to someone explain my own feelings to me. They spoke calmly, confidently, as if they knew me better than I knew myself. "You're just tired," they said. "You don't mean what you're saying." And I believed them. Because believing them meant I didn't have to trust myself. That's when I understood how breaking really happens. Not through force but through repetition. Through small dismissals that accumulate. Through moments where your reality is gently rewritten until you stop recognizing it. On stage I was powerful. Off stage I was malleable. The contrast exhausted me. I began using silence as a survival tool. If I didn't speak, I couldn't be corrected. If I didn't argue, I couldn't be dismissed. Silence felt safer than asserting myself. But silence is not peace. It's compression. Pressure builds quietly until something has to give. During a recording session I missed a note, just barely. A producer laughed lightly and said, "Come on, Whit, you're better than that." It wasn't cruel. But it landed like a verdict. I smiled, apologized, and tried again. Perfect this time. Still something inside me recoiled. Why did imperfection feel dangerous? Why did love feel conditional on performance? Even in rooms that claimed to care about me. That night, alone again, I sat on the floor with my back against the bed and finally let myself feel it. The sadness, the resentment, the grief for the version of me who didn't know she was allowed to say no. Tears came quietly, almost politely. No sobbing. Just release. I whispered something out loud without meaning to. I don't know who I am without being needed. The words startled me. They were true. Fame didn't teach me that. People did. People who benefited from my flexibility, from my generosity, from my fear of disappointing them. I had confused being loved with being useful. And that confusion was costing me everything. The next day I tried something small. Said no. Not dramatically. Not defiantly. Just calmly. The reaction was immediate. Surprise. Then discomfort. Then subtle irritation. Someone laughed it off. That's not like you. Exactly. That response told me everything I needed to know. The version of me they preferred was compliant. And the moment I stepped outside that role, the air shifted. I realized then that whatever was breaking me wasn't fame or music or pressure. It was the slow realization that the more I became myself, the less convenient I became to others. And that realization brought a terrifying question to the surface, one I couldn't ignore anymore. If I stopped giving people what they expected from me, who would still choose to stay? When you start pulling back even slightly, you learn who is holding you in place. At first, I thought the discomfort I felt after saying no would fade. That people would adjust, that relationships would rebalance themselves around a more honest version of me. I wanted to believe that love could survive boundaries. But boundaries have a way of exposing motives. I noticed it in the pauses, the delayed responses, the way conversations shifted tone when I didn't immediately agree. Suddenly, I was being described as difficult, sensitive, going through something. Labels appeared where understanding should have been. I hadn't changed that much. I had just stopped absorbing everything quietly. One afternoon, I walked into a meeting already in progress. The room fell silent for half a second, just long enough for me to register it. Papers were shuffled. Someone cleared their throat. "We were just talking about you," someone said with a smile that didn't reach their eyes. I sat down slowly. "That makes sense," I replied. They laughed. Too quickly. The conversation resumed, but it no longer included me. Decisions were discussed around me, not with me. I was present, but no longer central. A strange feeling for someone whose name was on the door. That's when the second crack formed. Not in my confidence. In my sense of belonging. I realized how much of my security had come from being indispensable. From being the one everyone relied on. The voice that sold the record. The face that filled the room. The solution to problems I didn't create. When I stopped volunteering to carry everything, the structure wobbled. And wobbling structures don't like witnesses. At home that night I tried to rest, but my body wouldn't cooperate. My mind replayed conversations, tones, looks. I caught myself rehearsing apologies I hadn't given, explanations I didn't owe. Old habits die hard. I stood in front of the mirror and studied myself the way other people did. Critically, searching for flaws. Was I colder? Harder? Less grateful? Or was I simply no longer shrinking? The difference matters. A memory surfaced. A moment from years earlier when someone had told me, "You don't have to be strong all the time." I remembered smiling and nodding. I hadn't known how to do anything else. Strength had been my currency. Vulnerability felt like debt. But strength, I was learning, can become a cage when it's expected rather than chosen. Few days later I missed a call. Just one. I was resting, sleeping, letting my body do what it had been begging me to do. When I returned the call, the response was sharp. "Where were you?" someone asked. "Unavailable," I replied. Was. Then a sigh. "You can't just disappear." I felt something rise in me. Not anger, not fear. Recognition. "I wasn't disappearing," I said carefully. "I was resting." Another pause. Longer this time. "Well," they said, "that's not how this works." There it was. The unspoken agreement I had never signed but was expected to honor. My needs were negotiable. Everyone else's expectations were not. That night, I wrote in a notebook I'd started keeping. Not lyrics, not plans. Just truths I hadn't said out loud. I wrote about exhaustion. About confusion. About how being adored by millions didn't protect me from feeling replaceable in rooms that claimed to care. I wrote about love that came with rules. And fear that dressed itself as loyalty. As the pages filled, I felt both lighter and more exposed. Writing named things I had avoided for years. It stripped away excuses I had relied on. I couldn't unknow what I knew now. The next time I walked into a rehearsal and suggested a change, a small one, the response was immediate. "That's not how we usually do it," someone said. "I know," I replied. "That's why I'm suggesting it." Silence. Then murmurs. Then resistance. I watched the room shift. Watched how quickly collaboration turned into defense. How my voice, once welcomed, now felt disruptive. I felt something fracture inside me. Not painfully but decisively. This wasn't about music anymore. It was about control. And control doesn't like evolution. Later, alone again, I sat with the realization that scared me more than any headline ever could. I had been protected, not cherished, for a long time. Protected from discomfort. From dissent. From myself. And now that I was stepping out of that protection, the cost was becoming clear. I could keep the peace. Or I could keep myself. But I couldn't do both. As I closed the notebook, a final thought settled heavily in my chest. If the breaking wasn't caused by fame, and it wasn't caused by pressure alone, then maybe it was caused by the moment I realized that choosing myself would mean losing people I thought I needed to survive. And the scariest part wasn't the loss. It was wondering whether I was strong enough to keep choosing myself once the consequences became real. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They arrived politely. A meeting moved without me. A call returned hours later than usual. A suggestion of mine forgotten, until someone else repeated it. Nothing dramatic enough to protest. Nothing obvious enough to defend against. That's how systems correct behavior, quietly. I felt it during rehearsals first. I'd walk in with ideas, with instincts sharpened by years of experience, and watch them dissolve into the air. People nodded, smiled, and then proceeded exactly as planned. I started to feel like a guest in my own career. One afternoon, after a long rehearsal, I asked to speak privately with someone I had trusted for years. We sat across from each other in a room that smelled like stale coffee and carpet cleaner. "I feel like I'm being managed out of my own decisions," I said carefully. They sighed, leaning back. "You're being protected." I stared at them. "From what?" "From yourself," they replied without hesitation. The words hit harder than any insult ever could. "From my instincts." "Yes." "From my experience." "From risk," they said. "From unpredictability." Understood then. Independence had become the risk. My voice, not my singing voice but my personal one, was the liability. I left that meeting shaken, not because I doubted myself, but because I finally saw the rules clearly. I had been allowed autonomy only as long as it aligned with what others found comfortable. That night I stood on a stage again. Different city. Same lights. Same roar. The crowd loved me. They always did. I felt it in the way they leaned forward, in the way the silence held between notes. For those moments, I belonged entirely to myself again. But backstage the temperature dropped. A stage manager avoided my eyes. Someone whispered and stopped when I approached. I felt like a rumor walking. After the show, a folder was placed in front of me. "Just some notes," someone said lightly. Opened it. Suggestions. Adjustments. Concerns. Pages of them. Not about the music. About me. My tone. My demeanor. My energy. My state. I closed the folder slowly. "So this is happening," I said. No one answered. That silence was confirmation enough. I went back to my hotel room and locked the door. I paced, barefoot on the carpet, heart pounding. Anger tried to surface, but beneath it was something colder. Grief. I grieved the illusion that loyalty ran both ways. That years of excellence earned trust. That my humanity was something the system could accommodate. I sat on the bed and thought about the little girl I used to be. Singing because it felt like breathing. Singing because it was joy, not currency. She would not recognize this world. And for the first time I wondered if I belonged in it anymore. The next day the pressure sharpened. A conversation turned confrontational. A suggestion became a warning. Someone said, "You need to be careful," in a tone that made it sound less like advice and more like instruction. Careful about what? Asked. They smiled thinly. About how things look. How things look, not how they are. I realized then that what I was experiencing wasn't conflict. It was containment. I was being boxed into a version of myself that could be predicted, controlled, marketed, and managed. My resistance, subtle as it was, threatened the balance. That's when the fear set in. Not fear of losing success. Fear of losing autonomy entirely. Late that night, I sat alone and let myself imagine the future if I kept complying. A slow narrowing. Fewer choices. Less agency. More silence disguised as peace. Felt sick. I also felt awake. Because once you see the cage, pretending it's comfort becomes impossible. I made a decision then. Not a loud one, not a public one. Private commitment. I would stop explaining myself to people who benefited from misunderstanding me. I would stop negotiating my instincts. I would stop mistaking access for love. The next morning I acted on it. I declined something important. Firmly. Without justification. The response was immediate. Concern. Then anger, carefully veiled. "You're making a mistake," someone told me. "Maybe," I said. "But it's mine." The room went cold. That was the moment I understood the real cost of choosing myself. Not punishment. Isolation. I was no longer the center everyone orbited. I was a variable they couldn't control. And variables make people nervous. As I walked away from that meeting, heart racing but head clear, a heavy truth settled in me. This wasn't a phase. This was a turning point. Whatever came next would demand more courage than I'd ever needed on stage. Because singing had never scared me. Standing alone did. And as I stepped into that uncertainty, one question followed me relentlessly. If choosing myself meant standing without protection, what would happen when the system decided I was no longer worth accommodating at all? Isolation doesn't announce itself. It doesn't slam doors or shout accusations. It whispers. It rearranges your days until you look around and realize there's more space than support. More quiet than comfort. After that meeting, the phone rang less. Not dramatically. Just enough to notice. Projects that once moved quickly began to stall. Conversations became, "We'll revisit that," and "Now isn't the right time." Invitations arrived already weighted with conditions. If I showed up, I was expected to behave. Not badly, just predictably. Predictability had become the price of access. I tried to ignore it at first. I focused on the music, on the one place where honesty still lived freely in my body. In the studio, with the lights dimmed and the microphone waiting, I could still be myself without interruption. But even that sanctuary began to change. During one session, I felt it. A hesitation in the room when I suggested a different take. A glance exchanged between two people behind the glass. The engineer cleared his throat. "Maybe let's stick to what we planned," someone said gently. I held the headphones in my hands, the silence stretching. "What we planned," I repeated. "Or what's safe?" No one answered. The track played on without me. That's when I realized how quickly absence can be manufactured. You don't remove someone, you simply stop making room for them. I left early that day and drove without destination, letting the city blur past. I thought about all the times I had been told how strong I was, how resilient, how capable of handling pressure. No one ever warned me that strength would be used as justification for neglect. I pulled over and cried. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just enough to release the ache that had been building behind my ribs. Tears for the version of me who believed loyalty was earned through endurance. For the woman who kept giving long after the exchange stopped being mutual. I wasn't angry anymore. I was grieving. The hardest part wasn't losing support. It was losing the illusion that it had ever been unconditional. Days later, a conversation happened that changed everything. Someone sat across from me. Someone with power, with influence, and spoke in a tone meant to sound caring. "You're creating distance," they said. "No," I replied. "I'm noticing it." They smiled thinly. "This industry doesn't respond well to unpredictability." "I'm not unpredictable," I said. "I'm honest." "Those aren't always the same thing," they answered. That sentence settled into me like a verdict. Honesty in this world was a threat. I went home and sat in the quiet, replaying years in my mind. Moments I had overlooked, warnings I had softened, instincts I had buried to keep peace. I saw how often I had been praised for adaptability when what they meant was obedience. That night I wrote again. Not songs. Truth. I wrote about love that felt like leverage. About success that demanded silence. About how loneliness can exist even when the world won't leave you alone. And in writing it, something sharp and undeniable surfaced. What really broke me wasn't the loss of approval. It was the realization that I had been complicit in my own erosion. I had stayed when I should have stepped back. I had apologized when I should have asked questions. I had trusted systems designed to benefit from my compliance. That recognition was devastating. It was also freeing. Because once you see your part clearly, you can stop repeating it. The next opportunity that came with strings attached, I declined. The reaction was swift. Confusion. Concern. Then pressure. People reminded me of what I stood to lose. Of my legacy. Of my reputation. Of how quickly the world moves on. I listened quietly. Then I said something I had never said before. "I'm not afraid of being forgotten," I said. "I'm afraid of being erased while I'm still here." The silence that followed was heavy. That was the moment I felt the shift. Not just in the room. In myself. I walked away knowing there would be consequences. Real ones. Professional ones. Emotional ones. Possibly permanent ones. But I also knew something else. Whatever came next, I would meet it awake. Later that night, alone again, I sat on the edge of the bed and felt the weight of the choice settle into my bones. The loneliness returned. Sharper now, but cleaner. Less confusing. Because this time I understood it. I wasn't being abandoned. I was being tested. Tested to see if I would retreat. Apologize. Shrink. I lay back and stared at the ceiling, heart pounding, mind clear. If I didn't retreat, if I kept choosing myself, the system would eventually respond. Not with conversation. With consequence. And as that certainty settled in, a final, unsettling question rose to the surface. If I no longer fit the version of me they needed to survive, what would they do to protect the image they built, without me in it? The system responded exactly the way I knew it would. Not with outrage. Not with confrontation. With distance. Days passed without calls. Weeks without momentum. Projects that once felt inevitable dissolved into polite delays. I watched it happen with a strange calm, like someone observing whether they had already packed for. I won't pretend it didn't hurt. Did. There's a specific ache that comes when you realize your value was never intrinsic to the people managing you. It was conditional. Renewable only as long as you stayed familiar, controllable, agreeable. But pain changes when you stop arguing with it. Instead of chasing reassurance, I turned inward. I spent time alone in ways I hadn't allowed myself to before. Not hiding, not isolating, but listening. To my body. To my instincts. To the voice inside me that had been drowned out for years by noise disguised as guidance. I realized something quietly radical. I wasn't broken. I was tired of being divided. Divided between who I was on stage and who I was expected to be off it. Between the woman who sang with her whole chest and the woman who swallowed words to keep peace. Between strength as performance and strength as truth. The breaking everyone talked about wasn't collapse. It was fracture from being pulled in too many directions for too long. One night, I stood alone in a room with no mirrors and no microphones and sang softly to myself. No audience, no approval, just breath and sound and memory. And I felt it. Not sadness, not relief. Integration. I didn't need to be needed anymore. That was the difference. When you stop needing approval, power rearranges itself around you. People who relied on your compliance lose their leverage. Silence becomes something you choose, not something imposed on you. I began to understand how fame had distorted relationships, not because of attention, but because it made people forget that admiration doesn't equal access, that success doesn't cancel consent, that a woman can be gifted and still be allowed to change her mind. What really broke me wasn't fame. It was the slow erosion of self-trust caused by being told over and over that my instincts were inconvenient, that my discomfort was irrational, that my humanity was a liability. Once I named that, it lost its power. I looked back on my life with clearer eyes. I saw how often I had been praised for endurance instead of protected from harm. How strength had been admired but never supported. How people loved what I gave without learning how to give back. I forgave myself for surviving the only way I knew how. And forgiveness, real forgiveness, is quieter than people think. It doesn't announce itself. It releases. In time, opportunities returned. Different ones. Smaller rooms. Truer collaborations. Spaces where my voice wasn't managed but welcomed. Where no one flinched when I spoke honestly. Where silence wasn't punishment. I learned to rest without guilt. To say no without explanation. To sing without negotiating my worth. The loneliness didn't disappear completely. Changed shape. It became solitude, chosen, not enforced. Place where I could breathe. And here's the truth people rarely want to hear. You don't survive fame by becoming harder. You survive it by becoming clearer. Clear about who you are. Clear about what you owe and what you don't. Clear about the difference between love and leverage. If this story has an ending, it's not redemption or tragedy. It's recognition. Recognition that what nearly broke me also taught me how to stop breaking myself. I wasn't destroyed by success. I was reshaped by the courage it took to reclaim myself from it. And that, quietly, deliberately, changed everything. Sometimes what breaks us isn't pressure. It's the moment we realize we've been living for expectations that were never meant to protect us. If this story made you reflect on boundaries, identity, or the hidden cost of success, sit with that feeling. If this story moved you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications to never miss the next story.